Okay, welcome to this latest Post-Brexit Clinic from Queen's University Belfast. I'm David Phinnemore. I'm joined by my colleagues Katy, Hayward and Melo Araujo to talk you through some developments around Northern Ireland, the Windsor Framework and UK-EU relations. We've each got a slot. I'm going to start off by giving a bit of an overview of where we are in terms of the Windsor Framework, UK-EU relations. Going to hand over to Billy to talk us through in a bit more detail where things are standing on some aspects of that UK-EU relationship and what it might mean for the Windsor Framework. And then for the highlight of the day, we're going to turn to Katy and the latest findings on public opinion in Northern Ireland on the Windsor Framework, Brexit, and a number of other issues. And she'll take us through some of those findings. Okay, so you're all very welcome. We're glad to see a good number of people here. I'm going to start by just reviewing where we are on the Windsor Framework, just to say it's been a relatively quiet period, certainly compared to a few years ago. Essentially, the institutions are working, so the UK and the EU are meeting fairly regularly. They had a meeting back in February of the Joint Committee and took a number of decisions there. You've got the statement which they issued there. It's quite brief. We've also had meetings of, well, one of the things they did there was add a piece of legislation to the Windsor Framework, a fairly small piece of legislation. We've also had a meeting of the specialised committee, which is dedicated to the implementation of the Windsor Framework. And for nerds like myself who follow these documents, it's a fairly upbeat statement from the co-chairs talking about implementation around the Windsor Framework. There's a fair degree of positivity there. It's interesting to sort of track this, considering where we were a number of years back, where there were fairly hostile statements, and there was no sort of joint statements. Each side used to adopt their own. So things seem to be sort of ticking along. There's still a range of issues which they're addressing in terms of implementation. There's some issues coming up in terms of what legislation might apply under the Windsor Framework, so discussions around the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, Cyber Resilience Act as well. But there's also a degree of optimism that some of the developments within the wider UK-EU relationship, which we'll come to, notably a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, will ease some of the restrictions on the movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland in the future. Okay. Domestically within the UK, one of the things we've seen since we last held one of these clinics was the response of the UK government to Lord Murphy's review. You'll remember in late 2024, the Northern Ireland Assembly held its first democratic consent vote, while there was a majority in favour of the continued application of the trade provisions of the Windsor Framework. It was not a cross-community majority. Consequently, the UK government was committed to holding a review. That review was chaired by Lord Murphy, and it reported September last year. And then the government responded fairly quickly and essentially agreed to adopt all of Lord Murphy's recommendations, including the one about a one-stop shop around information about the operation of the Windsor Framework arrangements, particularly around the movement of goods, and progress is underway to establishing that one-stop shop, so we understand. What we've also seen is a very detailed report by the House of Lords Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee on Northern Ireland's voice in the context of the Windsor Framework. Lots of detailed recommendations in there about how the Windsor Framework is managed, how Northern Ireland's voice feeds into its operation. And the UK government came back in February with its response, picking up on a number of the recommendations. But I think as far as the House of Lords is concerned, not actually addressing all of them to the extent which the report suggested it should. Okay. What we've also had very recently is the UK Supreme Court's ruling in Dillon, very important in terms of the application of Article 2. We're going to leave that to some legal colleagues to address in their various seminars over the forthcoming weeks as people review what is a very lengthy judgment and take on board what its implications will be. Okay. Then we come to the broader context of the UK-EU relationship. You'll remember that back in May last year, the UK and the EU adopted a common understanding in which they identified a whole series of areas where the UK and the EU are going to pursue closer cooperation. You've got them listed there on the left-hand side. A number of these were particularly important in the context of the Windsor Framework. In terms of energy cooperation, common SPS area, sanitary and phytosanitary area, and the linking of emissions trading systems. And this is what I'm going to hand over to Billy to talk us through in a bit more detail in a moment. What we do know is that negotiations have started on the SPS agreement, the emissions trading systems. And we understand that there's a possibility that they may be concluded in time for a UK-EU summit, which is penciled in, I think, for sort of July time. There's no date that's actually been set as yet. And we've also had the opening of negotiations on electricity as well, which is quite important. And part of that has also been the UK agreeing to participate and the EU agreeing to the UK's participation in Erasmus Plus for 2027. Okay, I think the politics in the UK is quite interesting at the moment. I suppose on the Europe question, we've had a series of indications over the last 3-4 months or so that the Prime Minister seems to be wanting to move towards a closer relationship with the EU. And there's been various reports of him signalling a major UK pivot. I think it's fair to say that we've not seen too much evidence or much in terms of the substance of what he envisages there. Consequently, there's questions on the EU side as to whether this is all taking just a little bit too long. And that also there's questions like, hey, well, to what extent does the EU want to play ball in the same way as Starmer wants to actually pursue the close relationship? Is the EU willing to engage on some of the issues which the UK is, or the UK government is pushing? We have to remember here that the Labour Party remains wedded to its red lines from the manifesto of not engaging on the single market, not re-entering the single market, not re-entering a customs union with the EU. So when earlier this week we saw the Prime Minister claim that he was going to put Britain at the heart of Europe, I think there were a few people with a little bit of a sceptical response to that. We have some colleagues at UK and Changing Europe writing an interesting blog saying the Prime Minister's new EU clothes, and questioning the extent to which there's any real substance here. I think this is probably a reflection of the sort of ongoing concerns that, okay, there's a lot of rhetoric around a much closer UK-EU relationship, where it's not too clear what the substance is going to be of that beyond some of the arrangements which are currently being negotiated. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Billy, who's going to talk us through in a bit more detail some of those arrangements under discussion and what those might mean. Billy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So what I'll try to do is to give you an overview of the ongoing EU-UK reset negotiations, focusing specifically on the trade dimensions, the economic dimensions of these negotiations. So I'll focus, first of all, on the negotiations on a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. Then I'll move on to discussions on ETS linkages, so linkages on the emissions trading scheme, and the potential reintegration of the UK into the EU electricity market. So in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, so for those of you who are not WTO law experts, that's just the technical term to describe rules which are intended to protect animal, human, plant life or health. So any agri-food regulation like rules on animal welfare, animal health, on the use of restrictions on the use of pesticides, rules on hygiene, on marketing of genetically modified organisms and so forth. So of course, once the UK decided to leave the EU internal market, it was no longer subject to EU SPS rules, which of course have meant that goods, agri-food goods that are moved between the UK and the EU are subject to regulatory compliance checks. This is also a factor in terms of the GB Northern Ireland relationship, because Northern Ireland, as you all know, is subject to EU SPS rules under the Windsor Framework. So that means that GB goods, when they moved into Northern Ireland, are subject to some regulatory compliance checks, although they've been slightly reduced following the adoption of the Windsor Framework. So the idea behind this reset is to negotiate an agreement on the mutual recognition of rules in the area of SPS between the EU and the UK, and what that means, practically speaking, is dynamic alignment. And we know this because both parties have said that that's what they're pursuing, dynamic alignment. And we also know this because quite recently DEFRA issued a news item saying, listing all the legislation, EU legislation, which would fall under the scope of this agreement. So you have over 70 pieces of legislation, all EU legislation, which essentially are going to be incorporated into the UK domestic system. So that's what dynamic alignment means. It means that the UK as a third country will have to accept EU SPS rules in its own domestic system. And that's important because what it means is that all the regulatory compliance checks that are associated with SPS rules are essentially removed. Very different to an agreement on mutual recognition of equivalence, which is what the EU has with New Zealand right now, where both parties maintain their regulatory autonomy. They have different rules, but they agree that those rules achieve the same outcomes. So that reduces some barriers to trade, but not all. With an SPS agreement, you remove all regulatory barriers to trade. Moving on to the emission trading scheme linkages negotiation. So again, for those of you who don't know, an emission trading scheme is essentially a regime which is intended to ensure that firms who pollute pay for the production of the emission of greenhouse gases. So the way it works, and this is the case both in the EU and in the UK, is that they've adopted a cap and trade approach, where there's a cap on the maximum level of greenhouse emissions that can be produced by firms that are involved in carbon-intensive industries. And within that cap, the national authorities can issue, for free, emission allowances. And then those allowances can be, those certificate allowances can be traded between those firms. But over time, the cap will be reduced, which means that the price goes up, and therefore you have an incentive for firms to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one problem with this system is that it leads or potentially leads to what's called carbon leakage, which is where a firm will decide to leave the EU or the United Kingdom in order to avoid having to comply with this system, and they move to a third country where there is no ETS scheme. They can produce their goods there and then export them back to the EU and the UK and avoid the carbon price. So to avoid this, both the EU and the UK have set up carbon adjustment mechanisms. In the EU, it's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And what that means in practice is that goods that are imported into the EU and which embed emissions have to pay a carbon price, the price that they would have paid if those goods had been produced in the EU. So this is a system. There are technical differences between the EU and the UK, but this is a system that is employed both in the EU and the UK, right? So there are barriers to trade associated with the operation of the carbon adjustment mechanism, which of course would impact both EU-UK trade, but also would have a significant impact for Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland, as it currently stands, is subject to the UK ETS system, with the exception of the electricity market. So what that means is that once the CBAM is fully operational, you have the possibility of Northern Ireland goods that are moved to the EU and to the Republic of Ireland be subject to carbon prices and all the other administrative formalities and reporting requirements that come with complying with the EU's CBAM. So linking the UK and the EU ETS scheme would not only reduce market access barriers between the EU and the UK, it would also address the problem that Northern Ireland has right now, right? In the sense that since Northern Ireland would be subject to the entirety of the EU ETS scheme, just like the UK, there will be no longer any need for these barriers to trade that are associated with the ETS and the CBAM scheme. Just a bit of background. The ETS is not universally appreciated, especially a lot of criticisms have been leveled at it by especially developing countries who feel that the financial and burdens are being placed on them to comply with these rules, even though they haven't really contributed to the climate change crisis. And there is a disputes procedure that has been initiated by Russia against the EU concerning the CBAM. So that's something which, if the UK is linked to the EU ETS, it will be part, or it will be not part, but it will be affected by this dispute. Finally, the integration of the UK into the EU electricity market. And when I say the UK, specifically GB, because Northern Ireland, the Windsor framework, is covered by the All-Ireland Single Electricity Market. So since the UK left the EU, it has a relationship with the EU, which is based on loose coupling, right? And what that means in practice is that although there is still trade in electricity, and there is a connection in terms of the physical infrastructure, the interconnection capacity, because the UK is not subject to the same legal framework, it doesn't have this instantaneous automatic access to electricity produced in the EU, and vice versa. And so what is being, the aim of these negotiations is to reintegrate the UK in this legal framework and ensure that we move from loose coupling to market coupling, where all of a sudden it would be, accessing electricity in the UK or in the EU would be a matter of just a few clicks, an automatic access because you have a fully integrated system. And again, that has huge impact for Northern Ireland because it means that there is no longer a different regime within the UK, one which separates Northern Ireland from the rest of GB. So just a few closing thoughts. I'm sure I've run out of time already, but just a few things to bear in mind as these negotiations hopefully move forward. One of the things that I picked up in the news is that it seems that, especially with respect to agri-food negotiations, so the SPS negotiations, there isn't a plan to put a transition period in place, which is surprising given what happened post-Brexit and the fact that we're still trying to transition away from a market integration to the TCA. And the evidence is the UK is still not fully applying all border checks on goods, EU goods moved into GB. So it's surprising that in the context of these negotiations, a transition period is not being contemplated. So there may be teething issues in terms of the implementation of these arrangements. The other question is, while I said future directions because I wanted to be positive, but really this is more of a negative comment in the sense that we have to be realistic about what is being achieved or what can be achieved through these arrangements. So for example, the SPS agreement, yes, it does remove regulatory compliance checks on agri-food products, but only certain checks, because there are other rules which affect agri-food products which are not SPS rules. And those can still constitute barriers to trade. And these arrangements do nothing when it comes to customs requirements, which are arguably more problematic. So all of these things are not going to be resolved. So we're not talking about unfettered access to the EU market or the EU's unfettered access to the UK market. Far from it. The other thing is that these, especially when it comes to the SPS, although it's an important sector, when you look at it in the grand scale of the UK economy, there are bigger fish to fry. For example, services are not addressed in any way through these negotiations. And the final point I wanted to address, which I think is the most important point, is that when we're talking about dynamic alignment and all of these negotiations, whether we're looking at ETS, SPS, electricity market, require the UK to dynamically align with the EU. All of these negotiations raise questions concerning the democratic legitimacy of these frameworks, right? Because essentially the UK is being asked to comply with EU law without having voted. It will have no seat in Brussels to vote in favor or against these legislations. It will have a decision-shaping power, it seems, in the sense that UK representatives can be present when these rules are being developed, but it can't vote on whether to accept these rules or not. So for the EU and the UK, that raises certain questions, and it places an obligation on them to really consider whether it is possible to create institutional frameworks, legal frameworks, which enhance the legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy of this system, both at the international bilateral level between the EU and the UK, but also from the UK's perspective at the domestic level. So is it possible to create parliamentary scrutiny processes prior to the integration of SPS rules within the UK domestic legal system? And what about devolved authorities? SPS, for example, is a devolved matter. What is the role of devolved authorities like Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales in shaping these rules? Anyway, on that note, I'll pass over to Katy.
Can I just jump in briefly and just ask people online, if you've got any questions, do please put them in the chat and we'll pick them up after Katy's taken us through testing the temperature 15.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasure to be able to present to you the latest findings of our poll, the Testing the Temperature polls, and as David says, this is the 15th we've done. I'd like to thank everybody who completes the poll with Lucid Talk, and thanks to Lucid Talk and Bill White, with whom we work closely on this, so much appreciated. So the response rate was slightly up on the response rate we had in our October poll, and the weighted sample is just over 1,050, and all these results are presented with a margin of error of plus or minus 2.3%. So as you know, you're familiar with this by now, we ask 4 sets of questions that are pretty much the same each time, so we can do some time series analysis. And then we also ask 2 other new sets of questions. So to start with the familiar ones, first on people's opinion of the Windsor framework. So these green lines on the graph there are to show you where things sat back in October and where the change has come. So where they sat in terms of positive views. And we see small amounts of change, not highly significant. A couple to highlight is in relation to people's sense of there being reliable information on the Windsor framework available and whether they have a good understanding of the Windsor framework. And there has been a notable drop in that. We don't know why that is. It could be perhaps because there's less coverage of the Windsor framework in the media these days, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But also when there is information on the Windsor framework and media stories on it, they may well tend to be quite technical. So maybe people think that they don't have as good a grasp of the Windsor framework as they did back in 2021, because these figures are the lowest they've been since our earliest polls. Another notable change is in terms of a drop in people thinking that the Windsor framework provides an appropriate means of managing Brexit. We also see a decline in those thinking that it provides economic opportunities for Northern Ireland. So when we saw the Windsor framework adjustments to the protocol brought into place in early 2023, there was a surge in support for it, particularly amongst softer unionists, and we saw that this correlated with people thinking that there were economic opportunities, so the dual market access idea. However, that has steadily declined over time, and we see this reflected in the difference between the poll in October and this one. We also note there's been a drop in those strongly of the view that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland. So back in October, that was 49% of people, and that's down to 40%. And this is significant because of course, the idea that Northern Ireland needed something particular, needed unique arrangements given its unique circumstances arising through Brexit. If people doubt that, then that's introducing an element of doubt to what is the foundational reason for the protocol Windsor framework in the first place. To look at the time series analysis, this is on that question about whether it's on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. You can see the difference made in the decline in people strongly opposed to it after the Windsor framework, and then furthermore after safeguarding the Union. But since that point, we've seen pretty much a steady amount of people, proportion of respondents thinking that it's disagreeing that it's on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. It's around 35-38% now. Where we have seen the change though since safeguarding has been in those strongly agreeing that the Windsor framework is on balance a good thing. So if you look there, that proportion is down to 12%. Back in the heady days of spring 2021, that figure was 18% strongly with that view. So this is a notable shift, and one, as I say, when you look at the time series data, you can see there's a certain trend in that direction. So overall now that figure is less than 50%. Another set of questions we ask each time is around whether the protocol Windsor framework is having a negative impact or a positive impact on a set of issues. No major shifts since our October poll. People's views on this are pretty steady. Typically, they view the impact of the Windsor framework on Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and constitutional place as being negative more than positive. We have seen a decline in the proportion thinking that it has a positive impact on UK-EU relations. Now, when we took our poll in October, that was the first poll we'd had since that common understanding was announced at the UK-EU summit in May 25. So maybe there was a sense that things are much better in that relationship, and that's dropped back again now. So we'll keep an eye on that one. There's also been a notable drop in the proportion, notable increase, I beg your pardon, in the proportion of people thinking that the Windsor Framework has a strongly negative impact on ensuring no diminution of rights. Now, this is, of course, this poll was taken in mid-April, so prior to the Dillon judgment. But again, this is something we will also keep an eye on in light of that judgment and any fallout from it. We also ask the degree to which people trust various actors in relation to Northern Ireland's interests regarding the Windsor Framework. No major shifts here. What is striking, of course, is the fact that all our political institutions and parties are more distrusted than trusted. This now includes the European Union, which previously enjoyed more trust than distrust. There's been a drop in trust for the EU, an increase in distrust. So we see now then that the SDLP remains the most trusted, although levels of distrust in it have increased, similarly to Sinn Féin. However, we've also seen a decline in trust in the Alliance Party, and the TUV remains the most trusted of all the unionist parties on the Windsor Framework issue. However, it is also the most distrusted party, strongly distrusted party on the Windsor Framework as well. So traditionally too, we've seen Northern Ireland business representatives are the most trusted. They still are, but that figure's dropped below 50% for the first time. Now, a couple of our new questions. What we tried to do this time was be able to compare Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And so one question they ask quite frequently in Great Britain on YouGov polls is whether people would trust a Reform-led government or a Conservative-led government or a Labour-led government more in relation to looking after UK's interests in that UK-EU relationship. Now, our question, of course, is slightly different because we're just focusing on Northern Ireland here. What we've done is compare our level, that trust poll, the question that we asked before, do you trust the current government to manage Northern Ireland's interests? We saw that result there. I should have said it was the highest ever achieved, 12%. Strong levels of distrust, 68%. Now, when we asked people, would they trust a Conservative-led government or a Reform UK-led government in the same matter, in relation to the UK-EU relationship, we see interesting findings here. So a Reform UK-led government would be the most strongly distrusted, but it's also overall the most trusted. Now, this is highly speculative, of course. People wouldn't be making these assessments in relation to actual experience, but even in principle, that's an interesting finding, including when we compare it with the Conservative-led government. The memory of what it was like to have a Conservative-led government managing Northern Ireland's interest in the UK-EU relationship is quite fresh, and the levels of trust there are just below those of the current government. I'll come back to those questions a bit later on in comparison with GB. Another question we asked so we could compare with GB was on Brexit-related identity, i.e. Leavers or Remainers. And we see that over 50% of people say that their Leave Remain identity is very important to them. And that's both Leavers and Remainers, a majority of both, and across the political spectrum as well. So it's not particularly associated with, say, strong unionism or strong nationalism, which is interesting. So I said we do some comparisons here with GB polls. Now, obviously, the GB questions are slightly different, and they are also taken at different periods of time, so just bear that in mind. So the poll I was able to find in GB that was similar to the Brexit-related identity question is the one that was asked by YouGov by More Common back in 2023, as to whether the way they voted was important to them. And in the past, a couple of years beforehand, 60% of people were saying that identity was important to them. That had dropped down to 4 in 10. In Northern Ireland, we still see, as I mentioned, over 50% of people saying it is. We also asked a question on the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as we know, both the Conservative Party and Reform UK want the UK to leave. You can see there the responses from GB in the YouGov poll back at the end of last year. 3 out of 10 people there want the UK to leave the ECHR, just under half say they don't. In Northern Ireland, when we asked that question in this poll, we see a higher proportion of people saying they don't want the UK to leave the ECHR, so 6 out of 10, but we also see a higher proportion of people saying they do want the UK to leave the EU, sorry, the ECHR, we've already left the EU. One thing we often find, comparing Northern Ireland polls to GB polls in political matters in relation to the EU, is that fewer people are of the opinion that they don't really mind about it or don't know. Another question we asked was whether the referendum was based on a fair and democratic process, and we also asked a whole set of questions on lessons from the referendum. And here we see comparison with GB, that a lower proportion of people disagree that it was based on a fair and democratic process. So the suggestion is that more people here think that it was fair and democratic than don't, than in GB. A question that has been getting the headlines today, which is good news for us, is our finding in relation to Brexit being more of a failure than a success for Northern Ireland. So most people do think that it's been more of a failure than a success. And as you can see there, that's predominantly amongst party supporters who are nationalist and non-aligned. Notably, UUP supporters are a clear majority of them think that it's been more of a failure than a success. Those parties who strongly supported Brexit, the DUP and TUV, a majority of them also think that it's been more of a failure than a success. 60% of Leavers think it has, 80% of Remainers think it has. And this is really a reflection of the particular conditions in Northern Ireland, of course. So when we compare the results, again, of that question and similar questions to results in GB, interesting findings here. So public opinion in Northern Ireland more or less is matching that in GB when it comes to the broadest question of whether Brexit's been a balanced bad thing for the UK. However, when we're focusing in on Northern Ireland, has it been more of a failure? We get those results and majority thinking yes, and that's primarily because, as we judge by the qualitative comments, people who voted Remain thought it was always going to be a failure. They didn't want it in principle. And those who voted Leave think it's been a failure here because they're of the view that Brexit hasn't properly happened here because of the Protocol Windsor framework. Another couple of questions on the future UK-EU relationship. We see more people here thinking that the UK should further loosen its ties with the EU than those in GB, and that's no doubt reflective of the fact that Northern Ireland still has strong ties with the EU, thanks to the Windsor framework. And we also see a slightly lower proportion disagreeing that it should. And then the question of rejoin. What is striking here is that the figures in Northern Ireland wanting the UK to rejoin the EU are more or less exactly what it was back in 2016 in the referendum. So 57% say it should, with 35% disagreeing, and that figure's almost exactly the same as in GB. When we break that down by party, we can see very significant differences, unsurprising ones there. The UUP results are very similar to the Leave Remain breakdown amongst UUP supporters back in 2016 itself. We also see, very interestingly, a striking gender difference in this as well, with significantly more females wanting the UK to rejoin the EU than males. Okay, and with that, I will hand back to David.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. For that, a lot of data, particularly on the back, given we've also got a lot of historical data as well with which to compare some of the more recent findings. Anyway, as I said before, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat. Thanks to those of you who already have put some questions in. I think we'll start making our way through those. First off to Billy, relating to the All-Ireland electricity market, does being in the all-island electricity market mean lower or higher charges costs for electricity in Northern Ireland compared to GB?
I think that's a difficult question to answer because right now, the all-island electricity market, Northern Ireland doesn't really rely much on electricity produced in GB. So it might mean that the difference is actually quite mitigated. It might not make that much of a big difference. But of course, that doesn't account for future developments, and both from the EU and in the UK side in terms of improving interconnection. So I think in terms of the wider picture, the geopolitical picture when it comes to economic security and energy security, I mean, it's obvious, I mean, we all know what's going on around the world, and there's an increasing push for self-reliance in terms of access to energy. And so purely from that perspective, a closer relationship with the EU actually makes sense. It makes sense from both sides, right? Because actually the UK and Northern Ireland, I think, as well as a net exporter of electricity. So there are opportunities there. The issue for Northern Ireland is not so much in terms of supply, it's more in terms of exporting. And so there actually the bigger gains might be in terms of increased interconnection with the whole island of Ireland with the European Union.
Okay, thanks. Good. Katy, good number of questions coming through on the polling. First off, one of our participants has expressed sort of, concern because 16% of those polled in Northern Ireland think Brexit has been a good thing for the United Kingdom. Was there follow-up questions for that 16% about the benefits?
So no, we didn't ask any specific questions on that. And I don't remember seeing in any of the qualitative comments. So we have a section at the end where people can write in, and we had just under 250 people doing that. And we do appreciate those comments actually, because they do give us some insight as to why some people answer the way that they do. And I don't think we saw any particular expression. I mean, primarily when people talk about Brexit still, and indeed the Windsor Framework, what we see from the comments are they're matters of principle. Primarily, we get a few practical examples or complaints raised, but it's really about the principle of it. And so I think they'd say on principle it was a good thing to do, perhaps.
And looking at sort of the breakdown of some of the responses, is it fair to say that Northern Ireland is still very much defined in terms of green or orange, or is it the case that the polls are suggesting that unaligned voters are a significant community now in Northern Ireland?
So we know from other polling and survey work that they are a significant community and indeed in some electoral results. What we see very much though is that it's sort of nationalists and others are non-aligned, and then unionists when it comes to matters of the Protocol Windsor Framework. The UP and softer unionists, perhaps, if you want to call them that, broadly unionists, they may sometimes fall a little bit in between, as we saw on the question of a question you showed towards the end there. But generally speaking, it's sort of unionists and then nationalists and others when it comes to EU. And that's primarily, I think, because, of course, nationalists and others primarily significantly voted to remain. And so then we're thinking about the significance of the Leave Remain identities. They remain so significant here partly because they're on top of those existing divides. But I wouldn't want to sort of simplify it as being green-orange. I think it sort of shows that actually because you've got non-aligned also often in that group of Remain and that Remain identity being significant, that it has added a new dimension to it.
Okay. Billy, what's your prognosis for this ETS agreement, for the SBS agreement? Do you think we're likely to see one?
You always ask me about predictions, and I don't like to make predictions. My sense, at least reading what's out there, what's publicly available, is that to the extent that both the EU and the UK have already seem to be in agreement on the main parameters of this agreement, so the institutional framework of this agreement, which is dynamic alignment, which is the dispute settlement mechanism seems to be broadly addressed in the, what do they call it, the common understanding, which was published by the EU and the United Kingdom. and since then has been confirmed in subsequent official publications from the European Union side. Those were the big issues, really. And now we see that DEFRA is publishing legislation within the scope of the SPS. So there seems to be a broad agreement on the main features of these arrangements. These are the important issues. If the UK is happy to go with dynamic alignment, which all the indications suggested that is the case, I see that there's a very strong likelihood that this agreement will be put into place. Okay. Now, in terms of the timeline, that's a different matter, because obviously the issue is that that's not the only thing that both the EU and UK are grappling with right now. So there's a question there in terms of where their tensions are.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue of the transition from the current status quo to any new arrangements. I suppose one of the concerns that we've picked up in some of the discussions we've been having is amongst producers here in Northern Ireland, or traders here in Northern Ireland, okay, who are still going to have to see full and faithful, timely implementation of the Windsor framework. Yet 6 to 9 months potentially down the line, a lot of the restrictions and requirements are going to be removed under the SPS. Do you have a view on that?
Well, the good news is that here in Northern Ireland, we're used to, transition periods which are not fully implemented or partially implemented. And the thing that business always tell us is like, we just need to have transparency. We need to know what's going on. And hopefully that's something which is happening, that there is, there are open lines of communication between public authorities and businesses. Now, the question of transition, this is something, I have to be honest, is something that really bothers me, because transition periods are just a completely normal feature of international trade agreements, right? When the first multilateral trade agreement was signed way back in the 1940s, it had in place transition agreements. It even created this special type of agreement, they called it interim agreements, which reflected that. The UK signs FTAs with countries like Australia and puts in place transition agreements for the implementation of TRQs. So I can't get my head around how we're not considering transition periods for agreements which are much wider in scope and have a much bigger impact on the economy.
It might be the difference, like the law politics point. Yeah. I mean, politically, they would want the benefits of it to be felt as quickly as possible, possibly not factoring in the fact that transition allows the smooth movement to minimise the risk of disruption. Yeah.
And for Northern Ireland, it's actually good, right? Because especially in terms of GB Northern Ireland trade, the fact that there was no transition period and you have alignment almost instantaneously after the entry into effect of the agreement, that's good news actually if you're involved in GB Northern Ireland trade. If you're a GB business, though, for example, who makes products where you're allowed to use certain pesticides which are not allowed in the EU, that's a problem, right? Because for some of those products, what are you going to do with them? Are you just going to throw them away? So you're talking about potentially huge losses for some sectors in the UK.
Okay. One for both of you, and I might come in on this as well. Okay, if there is agreement on an SPS and an ETS agreement, how can Northern Ireland Assembly Executive better resource its work to engage in monitoring EU legislation and spot any potential problems issues? You raised the issue about sort of democratic scrutiny and engagement, decision shaping. Any suggestions?
We need Lisa here.
I call it Lisa. Okay.
I think so. So it highlights the importance of the communication between Westminster and Whitehall and Stormont, first and foremost. But I think there's some lessons to be learned from Northern Ireland about how to do it, how not to do it, and primarily about the complexity. So we've seen this so much. And of course, it was highlighted in Lord Murphy's report as well, the need to resource committees for this and to enable as Billy's already mentioned, actually, the scrutiny of the legislation and being aware of what's coming down the line. So I'd almost see Northern Ireland as being a good example that the UK could learn from and develop better ways of managing things, and that close communication from Brussels would be really helpful.
Yes, I suppose one of the things we've seen is the importance flagged of sort of informal liaisons, making sure you have a presence in Brussels, making sure the information is flowing, that you've got the contacts. It's a really difficult process of accessing the information to know what's coming down the line. I think what we also have seen in the context of the Windsor framework is how that information, once it's secured by London, is shared within the devolved. And I think Billy made this point about, okay, well, democratic legitimacy of this process. How do you involve the devolves in this process? How do you feed in the voices of Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast into the UK government's position? I suppose there's also another dimension there is how do you ensure that the Windsor framework arrangements work with the arrangements for GB as well?
And I think that's actually an added argument to enhance the involvement of devolves in the process, especially Northern Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there is a good argument to make that to the extent that UK is involved in decision shaping, so decision shaping in the sense of it's present in the rooms where these SPS measures are being discussed, are being developed, why not have devolved representatives who actually are experts in these fields, because these are devolved matters present in the room, feeding into the process. And then they can bring back that information with them and ensure that devolved authorities understand what's happening without having to go via London and can prepare in accordance with that.
Got some more polling questions. Did any respondent highlight a true benefit of having the Windsor framework in Northern Ireland, or a definite negative? Many answers say people are missing the opportunity to keep a foot in the EU for goods as well as the UK.
Yes, I get. So again, thinking of the qualitative comments, we don't tend to get many talking about the potential economic opportunities. What was the beginning of that question?
Any respondent highlight a true benefit of having the Windsor framework in Northern Ireland?
No, I can't think of any. But essentially, so I think if we're looking at the bigger picture here, it's the Windsor Framework Protocol is a compromise on a very complicated, politically sensitive matter, and I think it's perfectly understandable why it is that you have a portion who are opposed to that compromise, and they're strongly opposed, and they remain of that view, and those who are glad of the compromise, but they're not going to be passionate about it. You get few people really delighted about the compromise, partly because they didn't want it to have to be made in the first place if they're Remainers. So this is always going to be the case with the Windsor Framework, and I think, of course, as well, so many years on, as more years go, the sense of the counterfactual, how things might have been, were we to have had Brexit without any particular arrangements for Northern Ireland. I mean, that gets more and more in the back of people's minds, and they sort of forget about all of that stuff that was potentially going to happen. So yes, I think that sort of explains partly why we've got that bigger picture of decline in support for it.
Okay. There's a question in here about any new developments regarding the Stormont break or applicability motions, which I think, Katie's nodding at me to take this one. So yes, if you think back sort of 3 years ago and the adoption of the Windsor Framework, one of the highlights of the arrangements was the introduction of the Stormont break, the opportunity for 30 MLAs to signal that the proposed change in EU legislation would have a significant impact on Northern Ireland, and therefore it should not be applied. They can make that case to the UK government. We've only had one instance when the break has been or the attempt has been made to activate the break, and that was unsuccessful. I'm not aware of any subsequent attempts. What's also interesting is that there's been very little activity around applicability motions, partly because there's not been many acts to be added to the Windsor Framework recently. But where there have been acts, the UK government has essentially taken the line that, they do not anticipate this having an impact on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And as a consequence, they don't see the need to put it to the Assembly in order to secure an applicability motion. Given the UK government's approach at the moment, which is sort of not to diverge from the EU, and it's also the fact that it's indicated that in areas where there's changes in Northern Ireland, it will not allow those to impact GB and I movement of goods, I can't see the UK government necessarily having to put many applicability requests for applicability motions to the Northern Ireland Assembly at the moment. Okay, that may change with a future government, but at the currently there doesn't seem to be much need from the UK government's interpretation of the statutory instrument to put things to the Assembly for a vote. Obviously, that might change. Okay, I was going to ask you, Katy, on the some of the comparisons between Northern Ireland and GB. Okay, one of the ones that you pointed out was on the question of rejoin. We haven't seen any change really in the percentage in Northern Ireland supporting rejoin compared to those who voted Remain back in 2016. But when we unpick the data for GB, we see increases in support for rejoin compared to the Remain vote in 2016, and also in Wales. What do you think explains the fact that, okay, those two parts of the UK have moved, but Northern Ireland hasn't?
Yes, and Scotland as well, of course, like more of them, is it 70%? Say that they want to rejoin. I think it all goes back to the fact of the overlapping of Leave Remain identities and then maybe particularly like political constitutional positions, which means that movement from those positions is less likely to happen than it would in a different context. So it sort of solidifies those positions somewhat. And perhaps, I'm just speculating here now, but perhaps to the fact that we haven't felt full fat Brexit, the full effects of Brexit mean that maybe the sense of, the concerns that may be experienced in Wales, England, Scotland, about what Brexit has meant to them, the real life impact of it. Because we haven't felt that here, maybe that hasn't seen an increase in rejoining sentiment in a way that we might otherwise have seen, perhaps.
Okay. More questions coming in for you, Billy. On the SPS agreement, if the UK secures the SPS agreement as you've described it, is that essentially the same deal that Theresa May would have had back in 2018-19, i.e. keeping all of the UK inside the UK single market regulations, laws and standards?
Well, it would be a slight narrower deal, right? Because we're focusing, as I was explaining before, we're focusing specifically on agri-food products, not the entirety of the EU internal market for goods. And even within agri-food, we're focusing specifically on SPS rules. And again, there's a whole universe of legislation which regulates agri-food products. For example, of things that are likely to become, hot topics in the near future, things like the deforestation regulation. They're already hot topics now, which also impact trade between the EU and in the UK, which are not covered by this agreement. So, whereas in the May deal, de facto, you would have market integration across the board on goods. Here, what you're talking about is market integration in a very specific area, very specific types of good and very specific type of regulation.
Okay. All right. So just reflecting back on it, what's actually being proposed in the UK-EU SPS agreement effectively brings the UK into the Windsor Framework arrangements regarding SPS. It's not actually much beyond that. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. That's right. With a few. I think there are a few laws that are not included in. But by and large, we're replicating the Windsor Framework arrangement as it relates to SPS to the rest of the UK. But again, with the understanding that we're dealing specifically with SPS rules, we're not dealing with all the legislation relating to trade in goods. And that makes a difference because it means that not only do we still have customs checks, we also have regulatory compliance checks. It's just that those relating to SPS matters, which were particularly problematic in the context of Northern Ireland, those are being removed now.
Okay. Yeah. So that's just reflecting on some of the polling data we've seen over time, it probably makes it very, levels of trust in the UK government, trust in the EU. I think what seems to be important here is that if and when we get an SPS agreement, an ETS agreement, that's not oversold as actually removing checks, controls, formalities on GB&I movements of goods, and that actually there's still a fair amount of the Windsor Framework in place, which sets out different arrangements for Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK.
And you'll know this very well. when you engage with businesses, what they'll tell us is the biggest concern still remains customs. Customs procedures, customs formalities, potential tariffs with the at-risk regime.
There seems to be in the debate in the UK, customs is seen as black and white in terms of it's a customs union with the EU or the current arrangements. To what extent is there scope within the existing trade and cooperation agreement for the UK and the EU to pursue customs cooperation, broadly defined, which might address some of those GBNI issues that we see under the Windsor Framework?
Right, so the TCA is very light on customs. The TCA is a funny instrument. It's a funny trade agreement because in the world of trade agreements, it's actually quite ambitious in certain areas. It does quite innovative things. So think, for example, of the level playing field provisions, rules on human rights, climate change, etc., subsidies. But then in other aspects, especially when it comes to customs, it's actually it's a very narrow, very shallow trade agreement in the sense that it focuses, for example, the rules of origin are very limited, right? And that's a big reason why we still have tariffs on goods traded between GB and the EU, and also the potential tariffs between GB and Northern Ireland. So the TCA doesn't do much for customs. The TCA, in terms of its infrastructure, is an agreement which was designed with the potential to grow, right? And so if you look at Article 5 of the TCA, you have this provision talking about supplemental agreements. So you can incorporate new arrangements into the fabric of the TCA. And I suspect that the SPS deal will be one of those, which will fall under the scope of the TCA. So there's a potential to have another agreement. You can have a customs facilitation agreement where you can reduce some of the procedural requirements, some of the documentary requirements. The reality is that customs facilitation agreements have limited impact, in terms of really truly addressing customs barriers. They don't remove the need for tariffs. If you don't liberalize rules of origin, you still have to deal with third country goods, right? And you still have to make that declaration. So those costs are very hard to remove unless you have some level of alignment. Now, within the world of customs unions, there are different types of customs union, right? You have the customs union, which the EU has created, but you also have customs union agreements with countries like Turkey, where you can agree to align customs on specific types of products, 40, 60, 80% of the products. So there is scope to pursue certain customs union alignment arrangements. The question, I think, for the UK, and this is, I think, why this isn't being addressed, is that it's quite complicated because since the UK left the EU, it set up its own tariff system. It's a far more liberal economic actor than the EU. It has lower tariffs compared to the rest of the world. It has negotiated a new generation of FTAs with important countries. It's now signed up to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. All of that would have to be revisited. So there are technical and political issues associated with that. And so the economic case for alignment has to be, pitted against the political case against customs alignment. I think there are a number of reasons why that avenue is not being pursued. And also, really, if you align when it comes to customs with the EU, at some point you have to ask yourself, well, why don't we just join the EU, rejoin the EU? Because if you're aligning on standards, which the UK is doing this unilaterally anyway, and you are coming up with common rules on alignment of customs, what's there? What's left there, right? So again, another tricky political question.
Yeah, well, there's also the issue with dynamic regulatory alignment that you're essentially a decision taker, or you're not a decision maker. All you've got is decision shaping. Sort of the issue which the Norwegians and that come up against all the time. Take on board a lot of EU legislation without necessarily a direct say. Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm just wondering, Katy, you got any final observations about or takeaways from the polling? This is poll number 15.
Poll number 15. So we've got one more this year. Look out for that. No, just thinking on the qualitative comments, some of the things that came through on that. So I don't know if I've mentioned in previous Brexit clinics about sort of rise in some of the sentiment regarding sort of sort of conspiracy theories, extremist thinking. We didn't see that so much this time round, much fewer comments around immigration, for example. Still, though, we do see a continued theme around democratic legitimacy and concerns about mistrust of politicians. And essentially, if people think that Brexit hasn't worked the way they thought it might, I mean, a lot of the blame is down to politicians in their mind, and you know, take your pick as to whether you blame the EU and Irish government or the UK government for that. So those sentiments are very much present, I think, and they are concerning given these enormous challenges that we see domestically and internationally at the moment, and it just shows the importance of efforts to increase trust and confidence that people have in the political institutions, and how Brexit has been such a damage to that overall.
Okay, well, we look forward to the next poll and seeing whether there's any reversal in some of these trends in trust. It does seem to be a downward trend almost across all of the actors we've been looking at. Anyway, as Katy said, we'll be polling again in the autumn, and we'll run another post-Brexit clinic then to look at the results. If you're interested in the report, we've got the web link there on the front page, which we'll bring up again when we close. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today, for all your questions. Hopefully we've been able to enlighten you a little bit, and also explain some of the interesting findings we've had in the polling more recently. Thanks very much from us. As I said, we'll be back again in the autumn and look forward to engaging with you then